wellspring that's given the world so much is drying up, neglected, misunderstood, and unheard.
It is only a few sentimental folklorists like myself who seem to be disturbed by this prospect today.
This folk music I'm talking about really should be known to the world, and you should be proud to disseminate it.
Another generation or two, and the only source will be the archive.
So I got interested in old-time music and went to the black section of town knocking on doors and looking for old records. And
I was curious about Africa and different parts of it and all these great field recordings.
I've been doing some research on these old artists from the early days.
It's early evidence of just the amount of research that he would do into a complicated project like that.
Doing this kind of stuff requires really a lot of reference material.
So I did a preliminary job of listening to records, and I'd listen to them and say, oh, this is a good one. It's the real thing. Or I'd say, this is just commercial junk.
Yes, of course you want good songs, but you're after the spirit of the place.
He fragments
Ideas and materials.
Raw material.
into a kind of a
collage and reconceptualization of that spirit in this new world context, in this modern context.
Because in all these songs, in all the fragments, what you have is the history of the people. It's the memory of the people.
try to reach within my own consciousness and memory and bring forth people and let them take their place on certain works that I'm doing.
People who see these works can pick out and understand that he's using the African experience. At the same time, they understand that they are not to be read strictly as African.
When I first began to do collages, I had no idea that I was going to develop certain symbols that have run through my work.
I studied the race problem.
He was knowledgeable about what was going on in the country with regard to race.
See, I know.
You don't know nothing about the race problem.
I'm taking a course in African studies at school.
For God's sake, give me a chance.
He was a black man in a white man's world. I mean, it's an extraordinarily sort of...
White boy, but with a brother on the inside.
White or black. Don't care what color you are. He can't feel what I feel because he never lived a slave life.
He had studied everything he did, but he came out like a musician.
Now, we're already defining this as a musical composition.
I got more and more into old music also. I had this attraction to old music.
He wanted old songs.
All through my teen years, I also got heavily into collecting stuff.
Stacks of records gathering dust.
Became more and more steeped in America's past.
What we're looking for, though, is not the old things, but basically the roots of the culture.
Ils ont oublié le racine.
In them we find the things, the values, the forms, the shapes, the songs, the ceremonies, because these are the roots out of which the American experience grows.
They're beginning to look back toward the mother continent of Africa, and they're gaining spiritual strength from these roots.
We have to have the type of understanding of Africa and the type of understanding of our people here in order to build a bridge, a contact, a line of communication between the two.
Now people say, oh, well, fine, you never connect with them. But the bottom line is this: we have more things in common than even the African Americans themselves even realize.
New bridges must be built because in the minds of the majority of our people today, Africa is too far away.
When Africans were taken as slaves to the New World, they weren't going to just remove everything about Africa from their brains just because some white people said they should.
There are genes in our bodies that respond to each other, that respond to our stories, our songs, our music.
No effort has been made to unite the Afro-American community with the African community.
I could see that this view of the big picture started to form.
These were new things that he was making, new forms.
It was a cultural provocation, an intellectual move.
It's the first time where we see this kind of public acknowledgement through the naming of the band of something that is African derived.
Since this revelation, a dialogue with the other world takes place.
Take us back to a little-known moment in American history.
When the slaves were brought to the ocean and they saw these ships.
They were able to creatively maintain some sort of memory of the African way of playing music.
Not to give up this African style of collective creation.
When the accused was arrested, we found these.
African rhythms.
rhythms. The African slaves, especially in America, held that memory of African rhythms back until emancipation.
We made a memory of our past and a promise of all to come.
Don't you hate it when people say colored or Negro and not black?
When they say black or Negro, it means you're not an American.
No, I'm not an American. I'm one of the
victims they call citizens
of Americanism.
1 or 2 times they arrested me, and I had told them I hadn't done nothing. They said, well, I arrest you in advance. You're going to do something.
It's a genteel slavery.
If you go to jail, so what? If you're black, you were born in jail. I don't see any American dream. I see an American nightmare.
When that man in the White House hear how sweet I can drum, he's sure gonna send down here and turn me loose.
Although they had legitimate aspirations, couldn't realize them in the bad old days in the state penitentiary, working under the whip and the gun.
He said, now listen, I'm gonna whoop you if you stand, and I'm gonna shoot you, I'm gonna kill you if you run.
First one drops their hands, is dead man.
Get him up. Get your hands up.
Kill a nigga, hide nothing. Kill a mule, buy another one.
This mule could be working, waiting, and learning and planning.
While those guards are shooting into the night, we're gonna be leaving.
He ran away to freedom.
Freedom, freedom. This is freedom.
Freedom! The path to freedom.
The freedom highway.
When they became free, an African-derived rhythm surfaced all over the Americas.
Deeply rooted in tradition.
Black tradition right out of Africa.
It began in Africa.
It's the magic of tradition as he brings an African scale out of this piece of Mississippi cane.
Well, first started to making them things. All right.
All through the North Mississippi countryside, the fife and drum bands call the folks to summer picnics, Afro-American style.
Africa.
The land where the blues began.
C'est ici où se trouve.
And so the blues were born.
The blues.
But I'm worried because the folk culture that produced the blues has almost disappeared. This music is from Lexington, Mississippi. A young blues man is playing his homemade one-stringed electric guitar. And his music is amazingly close to the sound this West African produces on his typical one-stringed instrument.
Actually sounds a lot more like African instruments.
The African musical bow, here played by two Bushman boys, is the oldest of these one-stringers.
What you saw after you saw them put together was
So the Mississippi Hill Country sheltered a fantastic African music that fed
the blues.
This is what blues is all about.
This is all it's all about.
And this is what it's all about, you know.
There's such a free-flowing thing about Malian music, almost jazz-like.
I wonder if there is a connection.
Jazz was born out of a fusion of African and European elements.
Seems kind of akin to American blues. I guess that's been mentioned before.
These are songs that go back in the black tradition beyond the Civil War.
Yeah, the Malian stuff is trippy in a different way. Yes. Very bluesy and very jazzy.
His social conscience was, to some extent, I think, developed.
You hear the best part of the soul of the common people, you know.
A sympathy with the workers that he was more engaged with.
Their way of expressing their connection to eternity, or whatever you want to call it.
Field hollers floating over solid syncopated dance rhythms. The debt-laden black farmer somehow recalled the wailing complaints of his ancestors under West African kings. It was the song of the individual caught between poverty and prejudice. A new flowering of rhythmic work songs.
Unlike many prisons in the North, where men often spend most of their days sitting around in cells, the inmates work in Texas prisons.
That's where we heard it, in Texas Penitentiary. The songs for work.
You go to work.
Work song.
The work song. Prison work song.
In the work songs.
In the way.
We meet the black pioneers.
All right now. Get way back on the line.
Back up the squad line.
Down the line.
That band gives the team spirit to play.
I get out and get on got my team now.
Where everybody would get together in union, in harmony.
It takes a number. The guards were brutal. The days lasted from dawn to dark.
From the rising till the going down of the sun.
The work pace was vicious.
Make the work seem easy even when it's hard.
A man who could not sing and keep rhythm might die.
When you're singing, you don't have, you forget.
Flight 115 from Cairo, arriving 425. Passengers now unloading.
One of the only reasons that we in the West have never organized, we have hated our image and our African image, because Africa has been in the hands of people who have created an image of Africa that's negative and hateful. And it has been hateful to us. We haven't wanted to identify with it. But now that Africa is getting independent and in a position to create its own image, and it's a positive image.
Black is beautiful.
Those of us in the West look at the African image and see how positive it is. We begin to identify with it. We become proud of Africa, and we become proud of our African blood.
Let some of the blues blood come out to show them.
It's coming from inside.
Inside of our blood all the time.
It's in the blood. It's in the bone and in blood.
I love it. It's in my bones. And it's in all of my children's bones.
Because it's inborn. You can't run away from it. No matter how far you try to drift away from it, you always realize that you're coming back there because that's what you know. That's what you're born with.
Harlem has the largest concentration of people of African descent.
Harlem. Yeah. Yeah. Home to every black man. What?
There are more Africans here in Harlem than exist in any city on the African continent. It goes beyond Mississippi. It goes beyond Alabama. It goes beyond Harlem.
I'm of African descent.
African descent.
And the rhythm, the producing music we play is African.
Is there a spiritual element to those beats?
Of course.
One thing that you can't take from an African is the essence of a beat.
Passed down to us through ancient spirits. The same great spirits that are found in America.
America.
You know, every traditional music in every single part of the world, in that case, Africa, the foundation is the spirit and the ancestors.
We have all traveled and gone far away.
They've traveled from West Africa to the New World and back again.
I want to go back home. Take me back.
Take us back.
Come back to where you started.
That then was brought back to Africa and caused a huge resonance. Because Africans recognized it already as one of their rhythms, repackaged.
So for us, this is very authentic and very original.
And this is what I have tried to do in my collages, to bring the Afro-American experience into art and give it a universal dimension.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Can I see in the chat, do you guys hear me? Anybody? Okay, good. Alright, thank you so much for tuning into our fundraiser. Today we're going to be featuring recordings of prominent activist James Baldwin and modern artist Arthur Jafa. Please listen in for their insights on the Black experience in America in the past decades and this decade. Baldwin's speech will be playing alongside computer-generated visuals derived from a recent protest pictures. These visuals were made by my friend Aman. You can check out their work on aman.work. I'm gonna link it over here. Boom. Yeah, so all of your donations today will be matched, maybe double matched. I'm trying to find somebody that works at Apple who is doing double matching, which means your $1 turns into $3 towards the movement for Black Lives. This organization has a great focus on divestment from the police and realignment of power, and just kind of restructuring law enforcement. These platforms of theirs address community, political, and logistical needs to support the Black Lives Matter movement. So if you'd like more information on them, go on m4bl.org. here. Okay. Yeah, I really like this organization, and they've been making waves in this movement and really contributing a lot. So I think it's a really good organization to donate to. So yeah, once again, if you guys hear anything that resonates with you or like something that you learned new, please consider donating. My PayPal's on the screen right there. It's paypal.me/VIVQIU, not QUI, QIU. So even though these recordings and the broadcast are almost 4 decades apart, they draw a lot of parallels regarding the Black experience in America. And I'd like to take a moment to point out a couple before we begin so you can kind of listen throughout the podcast. The first one, and probably the most bleak parallel that we see, especially today, is that nothing has changed. James Baldwin, in his speech, equates being a Black man in the past, present, or future to being just another survivor of the last slave rebellion, which is to say that regardless of the explicit overt status of slavery in America, Black people are still oppressed today and still losing their lives over their skin color. And Jafa touches on this point as well. We'll be playing his recording after Baldwin's. He challenges the idea that things are better, which is something that the interviewer states. He challenges the notion that there has been progress at all for racial equality in America, especially when he describes the response in the Black community to Trump's election. So guys, listen for that. And that brings us to the second parallel, the validity of a Black person's existence in America. Baldwin really poignantly says in his intro, if you're fighting for civil rights, that means you are not a citizen. And this lack of validity is also exemplified through the address of the Black man in the arts, in literature. Both of these speakers draw attention to the lack of content that addresses the Black experience or addresses the Black man. Baldwin points this out when he talks about how little he related to Huckleberry Finn's predicament of whether or not to bring Jim back into slavery. You can also see this when Jafa explains his statement, explaining his previous statement that he made that he's not interested in making art for white people. Jafa states that there's enough art, enough voices talking to white people, they don't need another. And then the third parallel is one regarding self-awareness, but not in Black people, in non-Black people. Both of the speakers remark on the white man's lack of awareness that he's contributing so much hatred and inaction and driving so much oppression into the lives of Black people. Baldwin illustrates this when he says, the only people in this country who have even a notion of who they are the Black people. Which Jafa expands on when he states that white people are just walking around thinking they're the good guys. He says something like, yeah, I don't care, they can experience all the privilege they want in the world, but they gotta know it, they gotta do it knowing they're the scourge of the earth. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy, listen and digest the insights of these recordings. I've listened to them like 4 or 5 times each, and they still hold water, and I think they're really valuable. So once again, if anything resonates with you, please donate to paypal.me/VivQ, VIVQIU. Like I mentioned, your donations will be matched and sent to the Movement for Black Lives organization. After the broadcast, we'll have a panel discussion discussing ways to contribute our skill sets towards long-term and short-term change for the Black Lives Matter movement. If you're wondering how you can help out, if maybe posting stories on social media isn't like your thing, I would definitely encourage you to just stay, and you don't even have to talk. We're going to be discussing just like a bunch of different ideas to support this movement, and we need all sorts of people. We need animators, we need graphic designers, we need artists, we need like people working in law, especially criminal law. We need volunteers for local community support, but I'll be getting into all of that at the end. So without further ado, I'm gonna play James Baldwin's speech in 1979 in Berkeley.
I'm going to improvise like a writer on some assumptions. And though I feel a little uneasy in doing this, in saying this, nevertheless, what a writer is obliged at some point to realize is that he's involved in a language which he has to change. For example, for a black writer, especially in this country, to be born into the English language is to realize that the assumptions of the language, the assumptions on which the language operates, are his enemy. When Othello kills Desdemona, for example, he says, I threw away a pearl richer than all my tribe. I was very young when I read that, and I wondered about that. Richer than my tribe? I really had to think about being as black as sin, as black as night, black-hearted. And in order, this is another story which I won't go into, in order to deal with that, really, to deal with that, at a certain time in my life, when I was not in this country, but in France, where I could not speak to anybody because I spoke no French, but no one wanted to speak to me. I dropped into a silence in which I heard, for the first time, really heard and began to be able to try to deal with the beat of the language of the people who had produced me. I might have been able to do that here, but in the event I was not able to do it here. I did it far away. And when I was able to hear that music, because when I was young, there were no black writers as models, and white writers could not be models either. I did not agree at all with the moral predicament of Huckleberry Finn concerning Nigger Jim. It was not, after all, a question about whether I should be sold back into slavery. I want to try to shift a certain assumption. I want to suggest that instead of, as we have now for far too long, according to me, instead of speaking about the civil rights movement, which is an American phrase, which I'm going to go into in a moment, which upon examination means nothing at all. Let us pretend that I stand before you as a witness, and let us pretend that everyone under the sound of my voice is in the same condition. I'm a witness to and a survivor of the latest slave rebellion. I put it that way because Malcolm X and I met many years ago when Malcolm was doing a debate with a very young sit-in student, and Malcolm was a black Muslim, and the radio station called me to moderate this discussion, which I did. I was not needed, I must tell you. Malcolm was one of the most beautiful and one of the most gentle men I met in all my life. He asked the boy a question, which I now present to you. If you are a citizen Why do you have to fight for your civil rights? If you're fighting for your civil rights, that means you're not a citizen. And in fact, the legality of this country, and I won't further investigate the word legality, has never had anything to do with its former slaves. We are still governed by the slave codes. Now, when I say a slave rebellion, I mean that what is called the civil rights movement was really insurrection. It was co-opted. Now the late J. Edgar Hoover is in his grave, God bless him. A lot of what I knew and many other people knew during those years, and only a fraction of what we knew during all those years, can now be more or less discussed. So one can say that the latest slave rebellion was brutally put down. We all know what happened to Medgar. And it was not some lunatic who happened to be wandering around Mississippi with a gun. The one lunatic in Mississippi at that moment happened to have a gun somewhere. And by some odd coincidence, unbelievable, shot Medgar Evers in the carport of his home in the sight and hearing of his wife and his children. And Medgar was 37. The lunatic was carried into the front door visibly of a nursing home and out the back door, and that was that. We all know what happened to Malcolm. We all know what happened to Martin. We know what happened to Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. And so many more. Honey, don't tell me. I mean, the list is long. That is the result of a slave rebellion. Now, I'm saying that since we are the survivors of it, since we have our children to raise, to save, I'm saying that to say a very brutal thing must be said. Must be said. The intentions of this melancholy country as concerns black people, and anyone who doubts me can ask any Indian, have always been genocidal. They needed us for labor and for sport. Now, they can't get rid of us. We cannot be exiled, and we cannot be accommodated. Now something's got to give. The machinery of this country operates day in and day out, hour by hour, until this hour, to keep the nigger in his place. When I was young, Among other things, I used to run an elevator murderously, but I ran it. I am not needed to run the elevator no more. A whole lot of things we used to do, we ain't needed for no more. On the other hand, we're here. It is true that this is going to be a difficult summer. In every city in this nation now, black father is standing in the street watching black son. They're watching each other, and neither one of them got no place to go. That is not their fault. It has nothing to do with their value, their merit, their capabilities. There may be nothing worse under heaven. There may be no greater crime than to attack a man's integrity, to attempt to destroy that man. For I know, in spite of the American Constitution, in spite of all the born-again Christians, I know that my father was not a mule and not a thing, and that my sister was not born to be the plaything of idle white sheriffs. What am I saying? I'm saying we find ourselves between a rock, if you like, and a hard place. I am saying something else. I am saying that our presence in this country terrifies every white man walking. I'm going to go back and clarify that a minute. I want to suggest, and it's a very important suggestion, first of all, this is not now, never has been, and now never will be a white country. There is not a white person in this country, from our president to all his friends, who can prove he's white. It is absolutely true. The people who settled this country came from many places, and where they were before they came here was France, England. In France they were French. In England they were English. In Italy they were Italian. In Greece they were Greek. In Russia they were Russian. It is worth noting, by the way, that this phenomenon called Europe has never agreed about anything at all except us. They don't get along until this hour. The only thing that ever unites them, the common market, for example, is about us. And they can't get that together. They're squabbling over what's left of their colonies. In short, they lost their clowns, Ray Charles might put it. And this means that we have to consider, first of all, that white, Malcolm said, it's a state of mind. Because I don't want to be misunderstood as saying, I'm not talking about white people. Insofar as you think you're white, you're irrelevant. We can no longer afford that particular romance. We are all, in any case, here. I want to point out a paradox. The only people in this country who have any notion of who they are, the only people in this country who have any notion of who they are the black people in this country. And I will tell you why. When the Italian got here, or the Greek, or whoever, there was a moment in his life when he had to start to speak English, when he became a guy named Joe. And that meant he couldn't speak to his father because his father couldn't speak English. That meant a rupture, a profound rupture. So the son did become a guy named Joe and never found out anything else about himself. We come out of a history, black people in this country come out of a history which was never written down. The connection between father and son, between mother and daughter, until this hour, and in spite of the danger in which we stand, and all that I know is happening all around us every day, we forged ourselves out of this fire. And if we could do that, and we have done that, we can deal with what now lies before us. I know I ain't got no jobs to give nobody. I know that. I know I ain't got no money. I can't co-opt you. I know many things must be done, and I know that I can't do them. But I also know that I haven't got to do them alone. We have never been alone. That's the mystery. Every white person in this country, I do not care what he says or she says, knows one thing. They may not know, as they put it, what I want, but they know they would not like to be black here. If they know that, they know everything they need to know and whatever else they say is a lie. Bear it in mind, children, I mean that. The American idea of progress, when the Americans talk about progress, they mean how fast I become white. That is a trick bag, because they know perfectly well I can never become white. I've drunk my share of dry martinis. I have proven myself civilized in every way I can. But there is an irreducible difficulty. Something doesn't work. Well, I decided I might as well act like a nigga. Now, the black people of this country stand in a very strange place. So do the white people of this country stand in a very strange place. And almost for the very same reason, though we approach it from different points of view. I suggest, you think about it, that what the CIA, for example, I use the word advisedly, example, or the President of the United States, for example, all ambassadors except one, don't know about the world which surrounds them, is the price they pay for not knowing me. If you couldn't deal with my father, how are you going to deal with the people in the streets of Tehran? I could have told you if anyone had asked. And the fall of the Shah did not in the least astonish me, nor did it make me sad. But this means that the black people of this nation represent for the Western powers, and for the Western powers, for the moment, bearing in mind what we must do to save our children, for the moment, let us substitute the word conspiracy. There is a reason that no one wants our children until this day educated. When we attempt ourselves to do it, we find ourselves up against the vast machinery of the system of education in this country, which is, among other things, a billion-dollar industry. And the billion-dollar industry is more important than the life of the child. Now, I want to suggest, and I want everyone to think about it. I know the machinery is vast, ruthless, cunning, and thinks of nothing, in fact, but itself, which means us, because we are a threat to the machinery. We have lived through, as I suggested, a slave rebellion. We cannot pick up guns because they got the guns. You know, we cannot hit those streets again because they're waiting for us. We have to do something else. Before each slave rebellion, there was something which I now call non-cooperation. How to execute this in detail is something each one of us have to figure out. But we could begin with the schools and take our children out of those schools. Take them off those buses. Everybody knows who thinks about it that you can't change a school without changing the neighborhood, and you can't change the neighborhood without changing the city. Ain't nobody prepared to change the city because they want the city to be white. All the American cities have begun to crumble when the white people moved out to get away from the niggers. Every crisis in every city is caused by that. How can you expect the people who cannot educate their own children to educate anybody else? This will be, well, contested. Nevertheless, one's got to start somewhere. And I'll use that as an example. There are other things I have in mind, but I'm not really a tactician. I'm a disturber of the peace. I want you to think about it. Because I know what can happen if you do think about it. One more thing. It is useful to bear in mind that this country, and indeed the West, has been living on a war economy since 1939. It is useful to bear in mind that we would be at war now if we could afford to be. Ain't no place left to go to war. All the colonies, though they still belong to Europe, are no longer where they were. Now it's a matter of getting the resources of the country out of European hands and African hands. And we are involved in that. The black people of this country are involved in that. If we, this country, could afford to raise an army and afford to go to war, it would do so. This country cannot raise an army to set anywhere in the world which it can trust. So, we hold the trump. When you try to slaughter a people and leave them with nothing to lose, you created somebody with nothing to lose. And if I ain't got nothing to lose, what are you going to do to me? We have one thing to lose. That's our children. And we've never done that yet. After all, we haven't done that yet. And there's no reason for us to do it now. We hold the trump, I said, right? Patience and shuffle the cards. Thanks.
All right, that was James Baldwin in Berkeley in 1979. Next I'm going to play an interview with Arthur Jafa. Yeah, please enjoy. And thank you guys so much for the donations. We've made a good amount so far. Keep them coming. I appreciate you guys so much. I'm so excited.
Can you state your name and describe what you do?
My name is Arthur Jafa, and I've been told I'm an artist.
You've been told you're an artist. Do you not think you're an artist?
I'm not sure. I'm still trying to figure it out, actually. So. But I make things on occasion. Mostly I think about things, but occasionally I make things that have some relationship to the thing, to what I'm thinking about. So
I wasn't going to start with this, but you've led us right into it. I really want to know why art, right? You trained as an architect, then you had huge success as a cinematographer, you still do. You've made brilliant music videos, which you arguably have more reach with than what you do in an art exhibition. So why move to installations?
Well, you said several things that I might dispute.
Good.
I'm not sure how successful I was as a music video artist. I mean, reach is an interesting thing. You know, there's long reach, there's short reach. May not be deep, you know. Increasingly, I'm interested in doing things that embody the complexity of who I think I am, at least, as opposed to necessarily like maybe reaching 1 million people, but it being a thing that's just by virtue of all the hands that have to be put on it, sometimes when a lot of money is involved and there's a lot of commercial investment in it, a lot of times the thing gets to be not really a complex embodiment of who you are. So, you know, increasingly, I just want to find the right amount of reach for the right amount of what I'm trying to articulate. So the space of art proper has just sort of made itself available to me. So I'm just trying to see what's possible inside of it, I guess. I'm still figuring it out.
There are some beautiful parallels between the way that assemblage artists at the turn of the last century sort of redefined our notion of actual art, fine art, and ostensibly what you do, the sort of video assemblage art or video collage, for lack of a better word, is really expanding our view of that small space. And I guess I'd just like to hear a bit about your process in the making.
I mean, I'm not sure. I hadn't really thought of myself in terms of doing assemblage art, even though I know that that's very much what it is. I mean, so often, to me, at least for me, a lot of these things come down to some very basic, like, sort of presumptions or assertions, perhaps. And, you know, an essential assertion is that most modern art, what we call modern art, the practices and stuff, are a subset or are derived from essentially African aesthetics. Particularly African aesthetics in two ways. One, in the traditional sense of a certain types of preoccupations, but also in the sense of like what happens to Black people when they find themselves in the West, and the way those aesthetics are forced to permutate because they are sort of radically alienated politically, socially, aesthetically from the context that they find themselves in. So to me, you know, like if you take John Cage and aleatory practices and stuff, that's just like a person who spent his whole life trying not to say improvisation, because improvisation had become so tethered conceptually to what Black people in jazz were doing, you know. So if you talk about assemblage, I mean, that's just, you know, taking a bunch of shit and making it work and, you know, accord with other things. I mean, a really good friend of mine's, you know, brilliant filmmaker John Confer said it best. He said, essentially, what we're trying to do is to put a series of things into some more sort of affective proximity to one another, and to figure out what they do as a consequence of that. And in a way, you could almost say, on a kind of maybe phenomenological, but also mythic level, when African peoples find themselves on slave ships, and the kind of a sort of existential world ending, but world making that happens when people are bound to one another, non-consensually, so to speak, the kind of possibilities that arise as a result of that is a kind of assemblage, you know? So I think, you know, the difference between, say, Africans and Black people is that, you know, we arrived in the Americas, if we're talking about Black Americans, we arrived in the Americas as Africans, but at some point, there's a line at which we become Black. And that's, like, centrally what I'm interested in. So I'm really very interested in making things that embody or attempt to articulate the complexity of that sort of transition, one sort of identification with a sort of imagined, because it's mostly imagined, like natal context, Edenic, you know, oftentimes unrealistically Edenic, understanding what that natal context might look like, and operating in the space of a lot of gaps in a sense, and filling in those gaps, and imagining that the way one fills in those gaps is the way they look traditionally, you know, until you come to see what the traditional thing looks like and you realize the shit that you filled in, the shit that you made up, you know, out of necessity. And so that necessity is improvisation, that necessity is assemblage, that necessity is, you know, so many of the things, process art, all the things that we talk about in terms of like modern art. You know, if you look at Cubism, its relationship to African art, all these things to me grow out of that one moment when the Black body sort of enters white space, and, you know, and the sort of fallout, because that's like an A-bomb that went off in Western culture, so it's like the fallout of that. And we have a very particular relationship to it because, you know, in some ways we were the first like sort of fleshly embodiments of the African artifacts that preceded us, but we also become very quickly, like to say, like ill sons, like we're the illegitimate sons and daughters of the West. So we have a very particular relationship to this otherness.
There's so much of that that to me is also tied up in rejecting like a monolithic or singular view. You know, I don't want to draw too many parallels, but you probably know her better than I do. There's this brilliant French feminist theorist called Luce Irigaray, who in the 70s, she talked a lot about how men impose a singular view on the world because of their very obviously singular phallus. And when I first saw Love is the message is death, the part that was so, I guess, immediately tactile to me was that, like, you're resisting a prescriptive, final answer. You know, joy goes into pain and pain goes into joy, and it's all, I don't want to use the word messy, but like complex, much more complex than I guess I'm used to seeing coming from a man. Does that resound to you? Does that?
Well, I mean, there's a question whether I am a man or not, first of all. Beyond that, I think, I mean, you know, I think messy is good. I mean, messy is, you know, blurred boundaries, you know, uneasy sort of concatenations, if that's a word I could use. I think, I mean, it's funny, like I was telling a really good friend of mine this other day, somebody took a picture of him walking down in the street, and he sent it to me and said, I think this might be the queerest picture of me that anyone has ever taken. And just recently we went to Pittsburgh together, and a really good friend of mine was basically interviewing me after a screening of Love is the Message in front of an audience. And he's gay. He was like, he said something like, well, you know, there's really just only one sort of representation of, like, you know, gay folks in it. And I was like, what? He said, yeah, it's just the boys dancing. And I said, well, I don't know about that. I was like, this woman who's walking away from the camera right there? He says, yeah, that incredibly sexy woman. I said, well, that's a man. That's Mika Prodigy. You know, and Mika Prodigy is as virtuosic in terms of what she does as LeBron is in terms of what he does. And I was like, and that, you know, and then there's Baird Rustin, you know what I mean? And I just basically started tracking through the video and saying, well, that person is gay or queer or whatnot. And I'm not so sure the grandmother and that person's gay. You know, I was like, so should I have a subtitle on everybody? So, you know, the thing, it's an interesting thing where if one of the goals, let's say, of the Black gay community is to be included, you know what I mean? It's a very fine line between being included in a certain kind of like investment in one's otherness, which I get as a Black person, you know what I mean? You both want to be, we want to be part of everything because you want to have the same sort of access and entitlement. You know, sometimes I say like there's a fear of radical difference, meaning like people say, everybody's the same. Everybody's equal in the way they conflate those things. Well, the same and equal are two completely different things. And I think that it's really important that we insist that radical differences are right, that we shouldn't have to be the same in order to have equal access to opportunity and entitlement, these kinds of things. So in the face of it, I think it's a very complicated and fraught, I think, like this whole sense of wanting access, the same kind of access and the same privileges that essentially you're supposed to have as a human being, whatever that might be. And at the same time, wanting very much, or being very ambivalent about it being included inside of this, you know, under the rubric of the human, just because of virtue of how that normally gets used. Yeah, I just, you know, I was saying to some people, I was saying like, if the two positions are to be a slave or to be a master, then one doesn't want either one, you know? And maybe we want to, you know, like my friend Carrie, he misspells mastery, you know, as a way to sort of, I think, get at, like, I don't want to be your slave, but I don't want to be anybody's master, you know, either. So, like, what other subject positions might one occupy? And I think inadvertently, Black people function as queer object in that sense. You know, we function as not comfortably inside of any of these categories. I mean, at our best, I think we function like that. You know, we oftentimes, you know, we have a very ambivalent relationship to things, say, for example, because when we came here, we weren't human beings, we were things of some sort. So, you know, we don't occupy the classic subject or object position. I mean, we're objects, but we're a very particular kind of object because we have feelings and we think things. We're subjects, but we don't have sort of sovereign reign over the universe. So we're these different kinds of things. And I think that space of being a thing is a very interesting space to occupy. And I think is at the very sort of foundation of why, say, for example, I think black music is so mesmerizing. I think that's one of the reasons it's mesmerizing, because it's operating in these interstices, and everybody gets that. Because you look to a black person, on one hand, a black person is like sort of the wretched of the earth, you know, like sort of abjection personified. But at the same time, people look at black people and know, like, yeah, there's some freedom there. There's some space to operate there that we don't have. And I think that's something that, as black people, we constantly struggle with, because we want to have the same peace of mind that everybody else has, even if that's real. But at the same time, we do understand, like, there's something very emancipatory about the sort of position we found ourselves in. It's like, you know, friends of my age would say things like, you know, the Middle Passage is an emancipatory moment, which, you know, for the generation that came before us is a horrifying thing to say. But it was how we were starting to feel, and like increasingly I feel like a lot of sort of the philosophical investigations and stuff revolve around this sort of conundrum, so to speak.
I mean, I am shocked to hear you say that, or to have a positive view at the moment. You know, whether we like it or not, we're in this post-Ferguson, post-Obama, post-Trump fucked up moment in American history, excuse my language. So like anything your work says about the Black American experiences in this context, and it's a context that for me, you know, as a kid when I was growing up, I thought things were better than they are now. That may be some of my own ignorance and my own sheltered upbringing, but it just seems that the moment now is bleak. Do you feel that way?
I don't think the moment is any more bleak than it's ever been. I think those terms are highly unstable, better. You know, that's a really unstable term. I'm not sure what that means. Yeah, I think it's something that's constantly under a certain kind of conceptual stress. You know, I think that Black people, and even the whole idea of Black people, which is a incredibly presumptuous, incredible generalization, let's say, but I feel like there's a sense that with Black people, like, it's sort of radically pragmatic. It's like empiricists, you know, it's like we are what we are, we do what we do, we don't actually get too preoccupied with trying to make a map of the world and then fighting about whether or not the map is accurate or not. You know, we just sort of deal with what it was. So like when Trump got elected, you know, people were like freaking out, and we were just like, for real? Like, first of all, they've been killing Black people like dogs, and that's been evidenced from, you know, citizen video and stuff like this. But even that, it's like, yeah, they've been killing us like dogs for hundreds of years now. It's nothing new, so to speak, you know. All through the 80s and 90s, Eleanor Bump and stuff like this, you know, right up into Rodney King, which is sort of the beginning of this sort of technologically documented sort of abuse that Black people were subjected to. Black people, like the police, are using excessive violence with us, and everybody's questioning, like, you know, the legitimacy of our what we were seeing, as if it was under question or something. And then you do the Rodney King thing, and then it sort of explodes. But it's like when Abu Ghraib happened, and there was this video documentation of, you know, basically perversion going on in these prisons and stuff. And I remember I was teaching up at the MFA program at Bard in the summer, and there's a big sort of gathering to talk about it. And it's just strange to me, like one of the people on the panel, he did this incredible like breakdown of the history of the iconography in the photos, like Spanish Inquisition, the pointed hats, and the KKK, and how they put the dunce caps on the guys, and all this kind of stuff. It's super incredible. But at the end of the day, he was like, part of the big challenge of these things is like, these images just came out of nowhere. Nobody could, you know, we just couldn't imagine these images. And I think it's like me and maybe 2 or 3 other black people in the audience, and we just sort of snickered, you know? It's like, are you fucking for real? Like, we can't imagine this? Of course we can imagine this. And we know that if there had been cell phone cameras doing slavery, there'd be more, you know what I mean, documentation of perversion than you could even contain in a building. So it's just, you know, I mean, a lot of that is just not trying to be like my suffering is deeper than your suffering or anything, but a lot of shit is just not even like worth debating for us. It's just completely off the table. So discussions about Trump, all that stuff is like legitimate agitation. How do we make change? All this stuff that's real. But by the same token, it's like, you know, these are not the worst times that there have ever been. They're not the best times that there have ever been. I mean, when Obama was elected, you know, everybody was running around like this was a golden age or something. You know, we had like black billionaires and all this kind of stuff, but it hasn't fundamentally changed the status or the wherewithal of black people, you know, in the world at all. So I think that kind of, you know, as Cornel West put it once before, what one cannot not know as a black person in America, you know, I think it still stands.
So
that makes sense.
Let's talk specifically about love is the message is death. And I'm gonna position this slightly with trepidation just because of my own ignorance I was worried about, right? So in seeing that work, some of the cultural references do go over my head, right?
Or under.
Or under, exactly. And I know that that's because of who I am, but I also, I read that you said you don't care, you're not speaking to white people, that you're speaking to black people. So I guess what I want to know is, do you mind that I love that work, that it spoke to me?
Oh, I don't mind. It makes me very, very happy. But it's just a matter of address. Like, one of the greatest things I think like cinema can do is it can put you in a position where you have to occupy somebody else's subject position for X amount of time. Generally, that sort of amounts to moving through the world as a white man, more or less. So I think, like, if you take a film that I worked on a long time ago, like Daughters of the Dust, I think not necessarily going to change people's attitudes about anything, but at least for 2 hours, you have to walk around in the skin of a black woman. Is that going to make you necessarily more sensitive to the plight of black women? Maybe not so, but I do think, if nothing else, what it does do is destabilize a sort of easy access to privilege and oppression of other people, meaning, like, you know, if you go to Nazi Germany or something like that, like, the first thing they do is they put people in dehumanized circumstances so that they can then fulfill their sort of assertion that these people are less than human. And that assertion that they're less than human, like, you would say, why does it matter? If somebody's your enemy, you just kill them. You don't care what they think about you, per se. Or you don't care that somebody else might look at your actions and judge them to be false. But what it's about is, like, if you're going to actually say industrialize the destruction of a people, then the person who has to do that, who has to pull that trigger, who has to close that oven, all this kind of stuff, they understand themselves as good guys. You have to understand that. They see themselves as right. But the only way psychically they can maintain that is if they don't understand you as human. Because we've all been sort of, I get funny about this, or certain inalienable ideas, like it's just inherently bound up in some transcendental way to being human. But I do think, you know, if there's anything, it's just do unto others, you know. And so if you're operating with that, then the first thing you have to do if that person is going to be able to efficiently exterminate people is they have to cease being people, right? So number one, what cinema can do is, like, make you have to work harder, so that when you step on somebody, at least you know you're stepping on a person, which means you're less than human, which means you're the bad guy in the narrative, right? Like, a lot of times what really angers me is, like, not that we're necessarily, like, winning these debates, but I was like, these motherfuckers be walking around like they good guys. I mean, bare minimum, they need to understand they are the stormtroopers, they are the evil empire, they are, you know, all the negative shit in the world, that's what they are. They can have their privileges and stuff, but they have to understand themselves as like, the scourge of the earth. That's how they should understand themselves. And so, bare minimum, in these sort of symbolic sort of tussles that we get in, that needs to be clearly asserted. So when we get into these things like in the sort of context of American politics and stuff, where the Democrats, say for example, are sliding the scale and they're becoming more and more conservative because they're more interested in being in power than asserting something that people can mobilize behind, then we allow them to shift the terms of what it means to be a good guy or a bad guy. I'm very problematic about the idea of good guys and bad guys. I feel like we have to question these sort of linear thinking in the sense the good guys have the white hats and the bad guys have, the black hats. I think that gets us into trouble. So we think that, so in even something like Love is the Message, I sort of very resistant to the idea of, it's a negative or a positive view of anything. So when people have come to me with a kind of political agenda, which I understand on a certain level, I can be a little resistant to it, because I'm not an activist. I try to be an alchemist or something like that, but I'm not an activist. I'm not out here, with some sort of legislative proposition in place. I mean, I'm trying to figure out how to embody the complexity of who we are. So it's going to necessarily have things that make us feel good and things that don't make us feel good, I mean, like in terms of making work, I always like to say, I just want to make work with unprecedented levels of ontological integrity. And by that, what I mean, it's like Mount Fuji. Like, I want to make things like Mount Fuji or Kilimanjaro, which means like, Mount Fuji don't really fucking care what you think about it. It doesn't really care if you think it's pretty art or ugly art, if it's good art or bad art, powerful or not. It kind of just is, and you have to kind of contend with it if you want to get around it or go over it or go through it or around it or something like that. And so I feel like I'm trying to make not just a work, but bodies of work that sort of insist on that, first of all, that you can deal with it as a singularity. So, back to the original question of like, who I'm addressing black people because I think that's one of the more positive and constructive things that you can do in the world, because what it does something, it makes available to non-black people something that they don't get to, it's a muscle they don't get to exercise enough, which is to not be spoken to all the time. That's part of the problem, right? In the same way, when women go to cinema and it's always coming from a male perspective, they develop the muscle to be able to go there for 2 hours, project themselves into somebody else's subject position and get it and have a positive, constructive experience, right? White men don't get to exercise that muscle enough. White people don't get to exercise that muscle enough. I'm not doing anybody any favors who's white or male by speaking to them. So I don't speak to them. I speak to who it is I know, and I feel like I can make a complexly embodied thing too. And everybody else gets to listen in. Why would you want me to speak to you in the first place? Everybody else is talking to you. You know what I mean? What's there to be learned from that? I mean, my ability to go in and look at something that has nothing to fucking do with me is highly developed because so little spoke to me growing up. So, my favorite, one of my 2 or 3 favorite films is like 2001: A Space Odyssey. Stanley Kubrick is a Bronx Jew who spent most of his adult life in London, right? I'm sure a black kid in the Mississippi Delta just sounds fantastic, and it was the last thing he was thinking about when he made his piece. But nevertheless, 2001 changed my life, So I don't think you necessarily have to be speaking to people. When people write a great love song, Eric Clapton does Layla, right? He's not speaking to everybody. He's basically writing that song to Patty Hansen. That's who that song is for. Everybody else gets to fucking listen in. If you try to talk to everybody, it's not going to be as powerful. If he tries to make this sort of generic articulation of love and obsession, it's just not going to be as powerful. So I feel like what I'm trying to do is address black people. We're human. You know what I mean? Addressing black people does not put it outside the realms of human articulation. Everybody else gets to listen in. And this is a very simple thing, really straightforward too.
And seeped in empathy in some ways?
Yeah. The empathy part, again, I'm making a big generalization about black people, but the empathy part is bound up for being chained on a slave ship with a bunch of other people. It makes, I'm I'm not saying that everybody who was chained on a slave ship developed empathy, but I think the majority of the people who were did. They developed a gestalt empathy. I don't even know if empathy is the right word. You know, Hortense Spillis said some really incredible things about, you know, the difference between flesh and the body. And flesh, she posited as being fundamentally bound up with these ideas of empathy, of the ability to feel what another person feels. I mean, that just goes back to why I think cinema in which the subject position is unstable or indeterminate and not like white male subject position is important for everybody to experience, because it gives us the ability to be in someone else's skin, which is just another definition of empathy.
So that for me is the thing, though, that makes your work so powerful is you're seductive in your juxtapositions of really harsh images and really beautiful, joyful images. And so you're sucked in, right? As the audience, you're pivoting back and forth between wanting to enjoy it and wanting to run away. And last night I had the privilege of watching Apex in my own house while my children were asleep and my husband was away. And having seen it in a public space, in the Serpentine first, and then seeing it at home, the sort of urgency of that piece got louder in the quiet of my house, you know, of how dangerous some of those juxtapositions can feel. And I'd love to hear you talk a bit about the difference of viewing something in a public sphere or in a dark cinema versus seeing something at home, and where do you want your work to sit?
I want it to sit wherever it finds itself. I mean, it's all about sociality, you know. The public cinema, the art gallery, your home, those are all spaces of sociality, even if you're occupying those spaces by yourself. Your kids are downstairs, they're asleep, your husband is away, but they still occupy that space. I necessarily sacrifice some of the power of Apex to include it in the mix. It's called the surge, that mix, because I thought it would contribute something to the overall experience, but it is certainly a very different experience to see it in a focused, you know, or intimate sort of context or setting. Again, it's just an alien artifact. It's my attempt to make an artifact with as high, as we used to say, an AQ as is possible. I mean, the alien quotient, like, how possible is that? I mean, let's say if there's certain sort of God-given difference that one is conceived, or, you know, at one's inception, you come with a certain level of difference. All human beings do. I find myself saying, okay, first of all, we want to amplify that, but even beyond that, can we envision and create differences that don't even exist? Because I do think ultimately, in terms of humankind, where we go will have a lot to do with our capacity to process the other. I mean, I think as a species, like, you look out into, you know, the galaxy and you see all these stars, it's like millions and millions and millions of stars and billions and billions and billions of planets. I mean, the odds that there are no other thinking organisms out there just seems kind of greatly unlikely. I mean, the arbitrariness of it. I mean, I suspect that we are being quarantined in some respect until we as a species have grown to the point that we have some sort of collective capacity to process the other. And until we do, we will be isolated, you know, but we figured out here, let's say on the ground, and then once we do that successfully, then I think the whole of the galaxy was, you know, galaxies will be opened up to us. I mean, that sounds pretty phantasmagoric, but I think that's essentially all this is. I mean, this might be some kind of preserve in which people actually individually as souls or spirits or whatever are just constantly returned here until we figure out certain kinds of things that have to do with processing the other, you know, our relationship to the other. I don't know. I'm not sure about that.
What about sound? So really interested in sound art, and I've always been caught up in this idea that our culture puts a much bigger precedence on your eyesight. So like, you know, all those age-old adages of beauty's in the eye of the beholder, you have to see it to believe it, and then if you say, oh, I hear, you're immediately implying that something is gossip or hyperbole and it's not truth.
Right.
And I think that you're bringing that to the fore in all your work. That sound is this, we try to forget it's there, but it has such a huge influence on us.
Well, you know, look, I mean, the straightforward answer is like that, you know, it's almost like Jay-Z man said, like, we're going to demonstrate the superiority of street knowledge. It's, you know, black music is the shit. Like, everybody knows that. I think it's undeniable that black music is the shit. It's undeniable that black music was the dominant expressive form of the 20th century. The question is like, what do we do with that? Why is that? Why is it that black music is powerful? I think there's a lot of ways to think about it. And I think very few of them have to do with anything remotely genetic or anything like that. You know, like, I mean, like one of the things I think, say for example, is like if you take a 1,000-year-old musical tradition, maybe the oldest musical tradition, continuity on the face of the earth, and as is the case in many societies, that music becomes bound up with power. I mean, I could think like traditional African music, this is a big generalization, but in many places in West Africa, traditional African music is bound up with power in the same way the history of Western painting is bound up with power. Meaning like, if you go into the Louvre, you're gonna see a couple of things. Like the majority of the paintings are gonna be either of the church or the ruling class, because that's who could subsidize painting. It's not that complicated. Music bore a kind of similar relationship as that sort of thing, a power dynamic in this traditional context. So, but what happens is, so you got this 1,000-year-old tradition of making music, complex, sophisticated, moving music, bound up to the narratives of the ruling class. Black people in mass, many black people find themselves caught up in the slave trade. They come to the Americas. So you got this incredible instrument that at the same time, and this is a kind of conundrum in the sense, at the same time that black people find themselves radically circumscribed as beings, the music is unleashed in a sense, because you got this, like I said, really sophisticated musical tradition that had just been tethered in a very narrow way to the narratives of the ruling class that gets unleashed in the context of the Americas. All of a sudden, this musical tradition now gets to sing the narratives of the working class or the peasant class or real people. And not just real people, and not just peasants or just workers, but workers in the most unimaginably dramatic circumstances you can imagine, right? So to a certain degree, I think the power of black music, almost on a quantum level, is bound up with that. It's bound up on the right tool put to the right use at a particular moment in space and time. That's why it's mesmerizing. That's why everybody's moved by it, you know? That's why you don't confuse black music with African music, which is great and incredible, but when you talk about music in the 20th century, you're talking about black music. You're talking about basically music from the Americas. And even if you point to things like Fela, well, Fela's thing was triggered by he and James Brown. It just led him back to his own sources in a sense. Traditional African music is incredible, but it's like traditional Western art. You know, it's just, you know, Greco-Roman art. It's bound up with the foundations of civilization. But if you're actually talking about what actually is articulating how people feel now, in the moment, then that's been black music for the last 100 years at least. And so, I mean, whether that will remain to be the case, whether it's going to continue to be the case remains to be seen. So when I think about the kinds of things that I'm interested in doing as an artist, but as a creative person who's not particularly musically talented or inclined at all, then I'm immediately sort of go to like, well, what makes black music great? Why is black music great? Why is it mesmerizing? You know, somebody asked Russell Simmons at one point, did he make music for black people? And this kind of reminds me a little question you said, like, am I just making shit for black people? Which is a very different question from who I'm addressing. But somebody asked him, was he making music for black folks? And he said, I'm making music for the consumers of black music. You know, and that's it's a little evasive, but I think he was really getting at something, which is to say black musical culture is complicated, it's complex. I mean, you know, Aretha Franklin's "You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman," great feminist anthem, well, it was written by a white guy, a redneck, you know what I mean? So black music actually contains more than black people. Black music is a space in which black aesthetic values dictate how things are going to be approached, but anybody can operate inside of it if they have, you know, the necessary, you know, relationship to the form. Bach, Beethoven, all those guys, they have to, first and foremost, be able to humble themselves in the face of the tradition. I mean, no matter how great they are, they can be the most singular genius ever to compose a piece of music, but they all have a humble relationship to the body of work as itself. Now, when it comes to black music, it's the same thing. Black people, black musical creators have that relationship to the music. Oftentimes, white folks don't. Like, one of my perennial questions is like, how come first-tier rock bands are always British and not white Americans? Why are white American rock bands never first tier? By first tier, you know what I mean. Rolling Stones, the Beatles, the Who, I mean, just Led Zeppelin. You can just go on and on and on and on. They're great individual first tier artists, rock artists who are white. Elvis Presley, you can go down the line. But very, very seldom groups. And I think fundamentally what that comes down to is this whole idea of your relationship to the body of work. I think individual white people can make that leap, that social leap in relationship to black folks, but I think groups, it becomes complicated because the group thing, white, black people, the group thing becomes complicated to navigate, you know what I'm saying? So it just all comes back again to your relationship to the body of work and like why that body of work is mesmerizing and interested in everybody in the first place. So for me, it's just, how do I sort of transpose those values and those capacities into these other spaces, whether they be cinema or art practice or architecture or not. That's essentially what I've been interested in.
I hoped that you'd touch on this without me bringing it up, but you haven't, so I'm gonna ask about it. I found it so interesting reading all your stuff on black visual intonation, and how, and this goes on from our discussion just now about music, but how worried notes are common. I mean, you can do this better justice than I can, but I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit about how you're mimicking what goes on in jazz music in your filming.
Well, that's just more what I was just saying. Like, once you decide that black music is the shit and that it's mesmerizing, then the question becomes, what's the basis of its power and how you replicate its power? And a lot of that can't be answered polemically. It has to be answered analytically. Like, what is it formally? Like, I can talk about existentially, this is the context in which black music found itself, and this context engendered X, Y, and Z, but it's engendering something. And once you talk about what it specifically is engendered, then that requires some kind of formal analysis. So it seems to me to be really clear from the beginning that there's certain things that we know are bound up with traditional African music, polyrhythm, polyventiality, these kinds of things. But in the context of America, then these sort of formal tropes end up being bound up with more so psycho-existential things, which is why a lot of those things have a kind of power other than just being a formal trick. I'll give you a perfect example. Like, one of the oldest ones is like a dub structure, what we would call the dub structure. And all a dub structure is just, I mean, you can even see formally these things happening even in a sonata to a certain degree, but a dub structure is like, well, all this music is playing, all the instruments are occupying the space, and then everything drops out except the single instrument. So in dub music, it'll be everything drops out maybe but the bass. So you're hearing everything, all of a sudden you just hear doom, 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 before everything else piles back in, right? There's an equivalent of it in jazz where everybody's playing at double speed, and everything drops out, but okay, that's the dub structure, right? So what that structure does, it makes you hyper aware of all the things that are no longer there. In other words, it makes the silence or the emptiness surrounding that single instrument really prominent. So like on a psychoanalytical level, I think in the context of black people in the Americas, what dub structure are about loss and missing. Because say it's one thing, and I've said this before, somebody kills my daughter in front of me, on a psychoanalytical level, I know what to do with my anger because I know where to direct my anger. But if, as has been the case, thousands and a million times, like in, on the level of like aggression, both explicit and microaggression, if it's the case that something happens to my daughter or my son or my wife and she disappears, she's made missing, that's a very different type of psychoanalytical anger, right, that you do, what you do, because in a way you can't unpack it. You know nothing good happened to them that you can imagine. So that sense of missing, I think, is something that you see getting played out in these dub structures. Okay, there's a kind of rupture, a loss, everything piles out, and in that kind of wish fulfillment way, it all gets piled back in. So it's like in the music, what you see getting played out, it's not just a rupture, but a kind of repair of that emptiness or that absence. Now, I felt like this was the case with black music, like that particular structure, like, okay, it's charged because of that. But then you saw things like in the 90s, like I became very obsessed and taken with like people like Pole and Basic Channel, essentially German dub techno. I mean, they were making, at one point, the best dub in the world. It was the best, like, say, by what criteria? Well, by the criteria that it was mesmerizing, right? And it was transfixing, and it was beautiful, and it was scary and spooky and all these kinds of things. So I found myself saying, like, okay, this is interesting that these German cats have adopted dub as a form. Like, what's that? What's that about? And I remember saying it to a friend, and it was like, well, you can't propose that, their experiences have been the same. I said, no, not at all. But the whole question of missing inside of the psychosocial dimensions of what it meant to be a German in the 20s, of course, is super central, right? It's just their subject position in relationship to the missing is a little bit different, but that form itself embodies sort of the erasure of Jewish people in the context of the German context. That's why I personally think the shit was mesmerizing. That's why I think they were drawn to the form. So those kinds of things become very interesting, but it requires a kind of formal analysis to understand that, particularly if you say, okay, you want to take a dub structure and then you want to transpose it into a different medium. Like, so say, for example, you asked about wording the note. Okay, so that's just a musicological, sort of analysis. Like one of the earliest missionaries who was in Africa, who happened to be a trained musicologist, had these notebooks. He did all these studies of black music. And one of the things that he said was like, the difficulty of studying the music of the Negroes is their tendency to worry the note, he said, to worry the note. And all he meant by worrying the note was that basically, in fact, if you do a formal analysis of many black musics, this is true also of many non-Western musics, is that what we call a note isn't a proclamation. So if you say something is a B flat or A sharp, if you put it on a scope, that B flat in black music is not really B flat. It just sort of fluctuates in the zone of a B flat, right? And that's a sort of a kind of, is almost the equivalent of a kind of quantization error happens where people round things off to their most perfect articulation of that note. So like say in the 40s, when Charlie Parker was making these unprecedented leaps of musical imagination and extrapolation, there was an obsession around Charlie Parker, and people would go around recording just his solos. Like they would go to his musical performances and turn the recorder off while everybody else was playing and just turn it on right before Bird took a solo. And what they found was that they would record these solos, notate these solos, and play them back, and they wouldn't be Charlie Parker solos, right? And the reason why is because basically the Western notational system couldn't account for everything that was actually happening in real time in the music. It could account for notes and approximations of notes and, these kinds of things like tonal registers and stuff, but it couldn't account for bent and slurred notes, like what happens in terms of the kind of gravitational field. It's kind of like if you took a perfect picture of a skyscraper and you thought that would be enough to build a perfect model of it, a photo, I don't care how much resolution it has, is not going to show you what a rivet and a bolt is. So even if you knew where all the bolts went, all the beams went, but you didn't know that there was a rivet that would hold the shit together, the shit would collapse. So that's essentially what was happening with the music, right? There are all these values, right, that really operate in the zone of non-tempered sound, or sound that's not perfectly balanced, it's not perfectly symmetrical notes. Like in black music, a note is an inherently semi-stable sonic phenomenon. It's not stable, right? It's semi-stable. So like if you say, like I say, A or B sharp or something like that, it's actually fluctuating in the general zone, but that fluctuation itself has a lot to do why putting this note next to that note will work, why formally they won't fall apart. So it seemed to me, bare minimum, that, you know, if you start talking about, just even anecdotally, like, okay, if you talk about black cinema, what it might look like, well, rhythm, okay, so how does rhythm come to play? Okay, then that takes me right back to very early stuff that it seemed really clear to me, like silent films are interesting, not because they don't have any sound, which is how it's normally taught. Like, they didn't have sound, they didn't have dialogue, so they had to be more visual. Yeah and no. A lot of it just has to do with they use hand crank cameras, and hand crank cameras necessarily produce what I call an irregular exposure interval, meaning the way in which the images are exposed, if you looked at the spaces in between them, they're uneven. And that basically clearly is an equivalent of non-tempered sound in Western music, right? Or outside of Western music. So that it seemed to me like one of the first things that one would want to investigate is how to fuck with this whole thing of the irregular exposure interval, you know, in the various ways that one could kind of go about doing it. So Apex is a very different, but similarly obsessively preoccupied as Love is the Message with, you know, what, this is just a rubric, black visual intonation, which is necessarily broad and not as specific as the actual categories that we've sort of mapped out over the last 20 years, and trying to bring, you know, into play, like in larger projects as we go forward. So it's been very fascinating to me that it ends up having a life in the context of art, because it was always, particularly with Apex, it was just an internal document. It was never even intended to be shown to anybody except the people that I work with, so.
What's next?
What's next?
Yeah, what's next? Like, the video work isn't the only collage you do. There was the Happening at the Serpentine, the show at the Hammer was a sort of sculptural collage. What's the next thing you want to do?
Well, I've been told time and time again that I talk too much. So I'll just be evasive and say a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff hopefully is next. I mean, I feel very blessed, you know, to be in a position to sort of, you know, make manifest things that I've been thinking about for quite a while now. So the cinema thing, you know, per my mantra, a cinema with the power, beauty, and alienation of black music, I want it to be way more than just sort of a provocative notion, you know. I want to make a cinema that is, you know, just unrepentantly bad, in the way that black music is unrepentantly bad. I want to make a cinema that does all the things, you know, more than you could, you know, account in terms of embodying like the complexity of what it means to be not just a black person, but a human being, you know, a very specific kind of human being, a human being that's been under a lot of sort of pressure. I mean, I think a lot of the pressure that black people experience is the pressure that will be more commonly experienced as we go into the 21st century, I think. You know, we are the first postmodern subjects in a sense. We're the canaries in the mine shaft. So where we go, I think a lot of people are going to go in terms of duress, but also in terms of the various ways in which, you know, we've come up with to process duress and what to do with it. Some of it productive, some of it less productive. So, I mean, basically, I just want to make work that's constantly, the things I think are next are gonna be bound up with that, you know? I mean, the specific things, you know, I very much want to do this piece called, you know, I want to do this thing called funk emitters, and so I've been, I should be talking about specific stuff, but I've been taking samples of sweat from under people's arms, black people dancing hard, and I just want to basically synthesize it into, like, you know, uncut funk, just a smell, you know? So I want to do shows where people come into essentially empty spaces and they're just confronted with funk, black people's funk, you know? Like Max Roach said about rhythm, he said it was both the most immaterial and most felt simultaneously things. So it seems to me like smell, if nothing else, could do something similar to that. So those are the kind of things that I hope are next.
Amazing. Thank you.
All right, that was Arthur Jafa. I hope you enjoyed that interview. Thank you guys so much for tuning in so far and donating. We have made over $1,600, guys. That is incredible. Thank you all for your generosity. I appreciate you. So this is kind of the end of our show. I'm going to conclude with an Yves Tumor song just to give you guys one last chance to donate. Yeah, so please donate if you haven't had the chance and are able to. Your donations will be tripled. So thank you so much and enjoy.